Every time we tell the story of Cleopatra, I think we're provoking the question, are women allowed to rule the world?
For over 2,000 years, the world was taught Cleopatra fell because Rome outsmarted her. Now, a newly uncovered Roman spy letter suggests something far more explosive. Hidden in the final lines is a revelation that flips the entire story of her downfall, hinting at betrayal from the one person she trusted most. If this letter is authentic, everything we believed about Cleopatra's end is wrong. What was found in this letter? Let's find out. The letter that shouldn't exist. In the spring of 2022, a construction crew was digging beneath the ancient streets of Alexandria, Egypt. They were installing new water pipes in the old city center, doing the kind of unglamorous work that rarely makes headlines. The crew had already punched through layers of Ottoman-era foundations and medieval stone when their drilling equipment suddenly hit something that made a strange, hollow sound. The foreman called for a stop. In Alexandria, you never know what you might find underneath your feet. The entire city sits on top of 2,000 years of history, buried and forgotten. Sometimes, construction workers accidentally break through into ancient tombs or Roman bathhouses that nobody knew existed. What they had found was a cavity in the bedrock, a small chamber carved directly into the limestone, no bigger than a closet. Inside, wrapped in deteriorating leather and sealed with hardened wax, was a clay jar, the kind Romans used for important documents. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities arrived within hours. They understood immediately that this wasn't a typical archaeological find. The jar's placement suggested someone had hidden it deliberately, carving out a secret space beneath what would have been a busy Roman street. This wasn't a discarded piece of trash or a lost artifact. Someone had gone to considerable effort to make sure this container stayed buried and protected. When conservation experts finally opened the jar under controlled laboratory conditions, they found several rolled documents inside. Most had deteriorated beyond recognition, reduced to fragments and dust after spending 2 millennia underground in Alexandria's humid climate. But one document had survived, protected by an extra layer of treated linen wrapping. It was a letter, written in Latin, dated to the 15th day before the calends of September in the consulship of Caesar and Antonius, which translates to August 18th in the year 30 BC. That date sent shockwaves through the archaeological team. August 18th, 30 BC, was exactly 12 days before Cleopatra's recorded death on August 30th. The last days of Egypt's final pharaoh, preserved in a hidden letter that was never supposed to see daylight. The document identified itself as a military intelligence report. Romans called these kinds of letters speculatores, spy correspondence sent from field agents to their commanders. This particular report was addressed to Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, the naval commander and closest advisor to Octavian, the Roman leader who would soon become Emperor Augustus. But here was the first mystery. The letter was never sent. It had been sealed, hidden, and abandoned in this underground chamber. Someone had encoded it, prepared it for dispatch, then deliberately concealed it, instead of sending it through official channels. The spy who wrote it didn't sign his real name. He used a code designation, Corvus Quintus, which means fifth crow in Latin. Roman intelligence networks often gave their agents bird names. Ravens, eagles, and crows were common choices. The systematic numbering suggested this spy was part of a larger network operating in Alexandria during those final chaotic days of Cleopatra's reign. What made historians immediately suspicious was the document's content. Even before full translation began, experts could see that certain key phrases didn't match the official Roman accounts of Cleopatra's death. The vocabulary was wrong. The timeline didn't align. The descriptions contradicted narratives that had been accepted as historical fact for over 2,000 years. Some scholars immediately declared it must be a forgery. The alternative was too disturbing to consider, that one of history's most famous deaths, taught in every classroom and depicted in countless films and books, might be based on Roman propaganda rather than truth. But material analysis told a different story. The papyrus dated correctly to the 1st century BC. The ink composition matched other Roman documents from that exact period. The Latin dialect, the handwriting style, the military terminology, everything checked out. Even the wax seal bore the authentic stamp of Roman military intelligence. This letter was real, which meant everything else might be wrong. The document went into immediate secure storage while linguistic experts began the careful work of decoding its contents. Because Fifth Crow hadn't just written in Latin, he had encrypted his message using a substitution cipher, the kind Roman spies employed when reporting sensitive information that could endanger operations if intercepted. Nobody yet understood what secrets the letter contained, but its very existence posed an impossible question. What did a Roman spy witness in Alexandria that was so dangerous, so contradictory to official history, that his report had to be buried rather than delivered? Decoding the impossible message. The encryption wasn't meant to last forever. Roman military ciphers were designed to protect information just long enough to keep enemies confused if a courier was captured. A few days, maybe a week. Nobody planned for a message to stay sealed for 2,000 years. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a cryptographer specializing in ancient languages at the University of Cambridge, took on the challenge of cracking Fifth Crow's code. She had worked on Roman military documents before, but this one was different. Most Roman ciphers from that period used simple substitution, replacing one letter with another in a predictable pattern. Julius Caesar himself had invented the most famous version, shifting each letter 3 positions down the alphabet. But Fifth Crow's cipher was more sophisticated. It appeared to use multiple substitution alphabets that changed throughout the document, making it nearly impossible to crack using frequency analysis alone. Whoever trained this spy had given him advanced tradecraft for the era. Vasquez and her team spent 4 months working on the translation. They started with words they knew had to appear in any military intelligence report. Standard phrases like "I report" and "the enemy" and "Alexandria." These gave them their first foothold into the code. From there, they built outward, gradually revealing more of the hidden text. What emerged was stunning in its detail and precision. Fifth Crow wrote like someone who knew he was documenting history. His observations were methodical, almost clinical. He recorded times, locations, names of Roman officers, and descriptions of Cleopatra's movements during those final days of August in 30 BC. The letter opened with routine intelligence, troop positions, supply lines, the mood in Alexandria's streets as the Egyptian population realized their queen was losing her war against Rome. Fifth Crow reported that panic was spreading through the city. Wealthy families were burning documents and burying valuables. The royal palace was in chaos. Then came the section that made Vasquez stop and reread the Latin 3 times to make sure she had translated it correctly. Fifth Crow described being summoned to a meeting on August 17th, the day before he wrote this letter. The meeting was secret, held in a warehouse near Alexandria's harbor. He didn't explain how he gained access or who invited him, but he witnessed something that contradicted every historical account of what happened next. According to the letter, Cleopatra was not preparing for self-death. She was preparing for escape. The spy described seeing the queen meet with Phoenician ship captains in the middle of the night. He watched them negotiate payment in gold and jewels. He heard them discuss sailing routes that would take them beyond Roman reach, possibly to India, where Egyptian traders had established connections, or to the Arabian kingdoms that Rome had not yet conquered. Fifth Crow reported that Cleopatra seemed calm and focused, not desperate or defeated. She was giving orders, making plans, organizing the logistics of disappearing with her remaining loyal followers. The spy noted that her children were being prepared for a long sea voyage. This was impossible. Every historical source agreed that Cleopatra spent her final days trapped in her mausoleum, surrounded by Roman soldiers with no possibility of escape. The ancient historians, Plutarch, Cassius Dio, and Strabo, all wrote that she chose death over capture. The story of her self-death by snakebite was one of the most famous deaths in ancient history. But Fifth Crow was describing something completely different, and he was describing it 12 days before she supposedly died. The most shocking line came near the end of the decoded section. Fifth Crow wrote that he had been discovered. Someone in Cleopatra's network realized he was a Roman spy. He expected to be killed. He was writing this report knowing it might be his last communication, trying to get crucial intelligence back to Agrippa before his cover was completely blown. Then came the line that changed everything. The queen will be gone before Octavian reaches the palace. What he finds will not be her. Vasquez brought this translation to a conference of Roman historians in London. She projected the Latin text on the screen and read her English translation aloud. The room erupted in argument. Half the scholars insisted the letter must be an ancient forgery, created by someone trying to spread false information. The other half demanded to see the original document immediately, but nobody could explain away the material evidence. The papyrus was authentic, the cipher was genuinely Roman, and Fifth Crow's letter posed a question that historians could no longer ignore. If Cleopatra was planning her escape on August 17th, what actually happened in that mausoleum 13 days later? The official story falls apart. For 2,000 years, the story never changed. Cleopatra died by snakebite on August 30th, 30 BC, locked inside her mausoleum in Alexandria. She smuggled in an asp hidden in a basket of figs, let the venomous creature bite her arm, and died within minutes. Her 2 handmaidens died with her, victims of the same serpent. When Roman soldiers broke down the door, they found all 3 women dead. Cleopatra still wearing her crown, arranged on a golden couch like she was simply sleeping. It was a perfect story, dramatic, tragic, and loaded with symbolism. The asp was sacred to Egyptian royalty, associated with the goddess Isis and the pharaoh's divine right to rule. By choosing this death, Cleopatra supposedly embraced her identity as Egypt's last sovereign ruler rather than submit to Roman captivity. Every ancient historian who wrote about her death repeated this same narrative. Plutarch told it. Cassius Dio told it. Even Strabo, who was alive when Cleopatra died, wrote it down as established fact. Their accounts varied slightly in minor details, but the core story remained consistent. The queen, the snake, the dignified death. There was just one problem. None of these historians were actually there. And Plutarch wrote his account more than 100 years after Cleopatra's death. Cassius Dio wrote his version nearly 200 years later. They were repeating a story that had been passed down through Roman sources, specifically sources approved by Octavian, the man who became Emperor Augustus after defeating Cleopatra and Mark Antony. And Octavian had every reason to lie. Modern historians have quietly questioned the self-death story for decades, though most were reluctant to challenge it outright. The problems were always there if you looked closely enough. Asps are cobra species, and their venom doesn't typically kill within minutes. It causes prolonged suffering, vomiting, convulsions, paralysis that slowly spreads through the body over hours. Victims remain conscious through much of their ordeal. It would have been an agonizing way to die, not the peaceful scene described in ancient texts. There were other inconsistencies too. Security around Cleopatra's mausoleum was supposedly absolute. She was essentially a prisoner, watched constantly by Roman guards who had orders to keep her alive for Octavian's triumph parade in Rome. The idea that she could smuggle in a deadly snake past multiple checkpoints seemed far-fetched, even in ancient times. Some ancient writers noted their own doubts. Plutarch himself mentioned that nobody actually saw a snake in the mausoleum. He wrote that some people believed Cleopatra died from poison applied to her skin, not from a bite. Others suggested she had poison hidden in a hollow hairpin. The SP story was just one possibility among several, but it was the version that survived. Fifth Crow's letter now provided a framework for understanding why. Octavian needed Cleopatra dead in a specific way, at a specific time, for specific political reasons. He could not afford to have Egypt's queen escape. He could not allow her to regroup in Arabia or India and potentially challenge Roman authority again. And he absolutely could not admit to his own Senate that Rome's most famous enemy had slipped through his fingers. So he needed a body. He needed witnesses to her death. He needed a story that would satisfy Rome's political class and end the Egyptian threat permanently. The spy letter suggested what historians had long suspected but could never prove, that the official account came from Octavian's propaganda machine, not from objective observers. Every detail of the self-death narrative served Octavian's interests. It made Cleopatra seem defeated, romantic, and safely dead. It turned her from a dangerous political opponent into a tragic historical footnote. Roman propaganda was sophisticated and systematic. Octavian controlled what information reached Rome from Alexandria. He controlled which witnesses were allowed to speak. He controlled the official reports that ancient historians would later use as their sources. If he needed the world to believe Cleopatra died by snakebite in her mausoleum, he had the power to make that story become accepted truth. What he couldn't control was a Roman spy who witnessed something different, wrote it down in code, and hid it beneath the streets of Alexandria before he could be silenced. Fifth Crow's letter didn't just contradict the self-death story, it suggested why the self-death story existed in the first place, not as history, but as necessary fiction. The kind of lie that empires tell when the truth is too dangerous to admit. The question was no longer whether the traditional story was accurate. The question was what really happened to Cleopatra if she didn't die that day in August, and why Octavian was willing to fabricate her death rather than reveal the truth. What the spy actually witnessed. Fifth Crow's report read like someone who knew his own death was coming and wanted the truth recorded before it was too late. The sections describing what he witnessed in those final days were precise, almost obsessive in their detail. This was a man trying to preserve evidence. According to the decoded letter, Cleopatra had been planning her exit strategy for weeks before Octavian's forces closed in on Alexandria. She wasn't acting like someone preparing to die, she was acting like someone preparing to vanish. The spy described multiple meetings between the queen and a network of merchants who specialized in moving people and cargo beyond Roman reach. These weren't ordinary traders. They operated routes through the Red Sea into the Indian Ocean, connecting Egypt with kingdoms that Rome considered too distant and difficult to conquer. Arabia, Persia, the trading ports of India where Egyptian goods had been flowing for generations. Fifth Crow reported seeing cargo being secretly loaded onto ships docked in Alexandria's eastern harbor. Not treasure or gold, though certainly some wealth was being moved, but the practical supplies needed for a long voyage and an extended stay in foreign territory. Medical supplies, seeds for Egyptian crops, scrolls containing administrative records and legal documents, even artisans and scribes who would be necessary to establish a household in exile. The spy noted that Cleopatra met personally with the ship captains, speaking to them in their own languages. He seemed surprised by this, mentioning that she switched effortlessly between Greek, Egyptian, and what he called the Arabian tongue. Roman propaganda always portrayed Cleopatra as exotic and foreign. But Fifth Crow's observation suggested something different. A sophisticated diplomatic operator who had spent years building relationships with traders and rulers throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. On August 16th, 2 days before Fifth Crow wrote his letter, he reported following one of Cleopatra's trusted servants to a warehouse complex near the docks. Inside, he witnessed something that stunned him. The queen was there personally overseeing the final preparations. She wasn't wearing royal clothing or jewelry. She was dressed simply, like a merchant's wife. She was practicing, the spy realized, for the role she would need to play. Fifth Crow described her giving detailed instructions about timing and routes. The ships would leave separately over several nights to avoid suspicion. They would rendezvous at a predetermined location along the Arabian coast. From there, they would sail beyond the reach of Roman naval patrols. The most revealing detail came when Fifth Crow reported overhearing Cleopatra discuss what would happen in Alexandria after her departure. She specifically mentioned the mausoleum, where she had been storing treasure, and where Roman intelligence believed she was trapped. The spy wrote that she referred to it as the stage, and talked about the performance that would convince Octavian she was dead. He didn't understand what she meant at the time, but he recorded it carefully, sensing it was important. The letter described one more crucial observation. On August 17th, Fifth Crow saw someone who looked remarkably like Cleopatra entering the royal mausoleum compound under heavy guard. But he had just seen the queen herself at the harbor warehouse 2 hours earlier. It was impossible for her to be in both places, unless the woman entering the mausoleum wasn't actually Cleopatra. This was when Fifth Crow realized his presence had been noticed. Someone in the warehouse gave him a look, a glance that lasted just a moment too long. He knew his cover was compromised. Within hours, he would either be dead or captured. Egyptian intelligence was efficient and ruthless when dealing with Roman spies. He rushed back to his safe house and wrote this report in frantic detail. encoding everything he had witnessed. He signed it with his agent designation, sealed it, and then made a decision that likely saved his life, at least temporarily. Instead of trying to send the letter through normal channels where it could be intercepted, he hid it. He carved out a space beneath the street outside his residence, placed the sealed jar inside, and covered it with stone. If he survived, he could retrieve it later. If he died, perhaps someone would find it eventually and understand what really happened in Alexandria during those final days of August, when Egypt's last pharaoh disappeared. The cover-up that lasted millennia. Octavian needed a body, not just any body. He needed proof that would satisfy the Roman Senate, convince the Egyptian population their queen was gone, and close the book on decades of civil war. Without a corpse, rumors would spread. Without witnesses, people would claim Cleopatra had escaped. Without an official story that everyone believed, the entire Eastern Mediterranean would remain unstable, so he created the narrative he needed. On August 30th, 30 BC, Roman soldiers dramatically broke down the doors of Cleopatra's mausoleum. Inside, they found a woman dressed in royal regalia, lying peacefully on a golden couch, apparently dead from snakebite. 2 handmaidens lay nearby, also dead. The scene was perfectly staged, tragic, dignified, and absolutely final. Octavian immediately summoned physicians to examine the body. They confirmed death by poisoning, noting small puncture marks on the arm. The physicians were Roman, appointed by Octavian. Their report went into the official record without question. Within days, the story of Cleopatra's self-death by ASP spread throughout Alexandria, then across the empire. But Octavian's propaganda went beyond just announcing her death. He systematically controlled every aspect of the narrative. He selected which Roman officers could speak publicly about what they witnessed. He determined which Egyptian witnesses were credible and which were spreading dangerous rumors. He authorized official historians to record the approved version of events. Anyone who contradicted the self-death story faced consequences. Egyptian servants who had been close to Cleopatra either confirmed the official narrative or disappeared from the historical record entirely. Roman soldiers who might have seen something different were reassigned to distant provinces. The apparatus of imperial control made sure only one version of events survived. The timing was crucial. Octavian had just defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra in the Battle of Actium the previous year. Now he was consolidating power, preparing to return to Rome not as a general, but as the first emperor of what would become a dynasty lasting centuries. He couldn't afford loose ends. He couldn't allow any suggestion that Egypt's queen had outsmarted him or escaped his grasp. Fifth Crow's letter never reached Marcus Agrippa because the spy never got the chance to send it. Egyptian intelligence likely caught up with him shortly after he sealed his report and hid it beneath the street. Whether they killed him immediately or interrogated him first, the historical record doesn't say. Roman military rosters show that an intelligence operative named Quintus Corvus was listed as killed in action in Alexandria in late August, 30 BC. The dates match perfectly. What happened to Corvus Quintus, Fifth Crow, was probably deliberate. Cleopatra's network would have wanted to eliminate any witness who knew too much about the escape plan. If he had talked before he died, if he had revealed what he saw at the harbor warehouses, the entire operation could have collapsed. But he hadn't talked. He had hidden his letter and taken his knowledge to the grave. Meanwhile, Octavian's cover-up expanded beyond just suppressing witnesses. Documents were destroyed. Records were altered. The archives in Alexandria, one of the great libraries of the ancient world, suffered mysterious fires and losses during the Roman occupation. Thousands of scrolls and official records from Cleopatra's reign simply vanished. Modern historians have always assumed this was accidental damage during the conquest. Fifth Crow's letter suggests it might have been systematic elimination of evidence. Egyptian sources that contradicted Roman accounts were labeled as propaganda or wishful thinking. Greek historians who questioned the official story found their work excluded from respected libraries. Over time, the only versions of Cleopatra's death that survived were the ones Rome approved. The cover-up worked perfectly. For over 2,000 years, nobody seriously questioned whether Cleopatra actually died in that mausoleum. The story was too consistent, too well documented, too firmly embedded in historical consciousness to doubt. Octavian's propaganda became accepted fact, taught in schools and repeated in countless books and films. until a construction crew accidentally broke through to a hidden chamber beneath Alexandria's ancient streets and found a letter that was never supposed to survive. A letter written by a dying spy who understood he was documenting something important enough to hide rather than destroy. Fifth Crow had kept one truth alive in the darkness, waiting for someone to find it. Rewriting history's most famous death. The discovery of Fifth Crow's letter forced an uncomfortable question into academic circles. How much of what we call ancient history is actually just successful propaganda that nobody bothered to verify? Within months of the translation going public, research teams began re-examining every piece of evidence related to Cleopatra's death with fresh skepticism. Archaeological records, ancient texts, physical evidence from Alexandria. Everything that had been accepted as fact for 2 millennia suddenly needed a second look. The body found in the mausoleum was never definitively identified as Cleopatra. This detail had always been in the historical record, but nobody paid much attention to it. Octavian claimed it was her. Roman physicians confirmed it was her. Egyptian witnesses agreed it was her. Case closed. But Fifth Crow's letter raised an obvious alternative. If Cleopatra was preparing a body double, someone who resembled her enough to fool Roman soldiers from a distance, then the woman found dead in the mausoleum could have been someone else entirely. A servant, a lady in waiting, someone willing to die so their queen could escape. Ancient Egyptians had a long tradition of using doubles for royalty in dangerous situations. Pharaohs employed lookalikes during military campaigns to confuse assassins. The practice was documented in temple records and diplomatic correspondence. Cleopatra would have known these techniques. She had every reason to employ them. Modern forensic experts examined the few remaining descriptions of the mausoleum scene with new eyes. The accounts mentioned that the woman's face was peaceful, her body positioned formally on the couch. But they also noted that Roman soldiers had waited several hours before breaking down the door, plenty of time for a body to begin decomposing in Alexandria's August heat. Positive identification would have been difficult even if the soldiers had known Cleopatra personally, which most of them didn't. The puncture marks the Roman physicians described as snake bites could have been made by any sharp object. Poison could have been administered in dozens of ways. The entire scene could have been carefully arranged to look like self-death while actually being something else entirely. A staged death meant to convince Octavian his enemy was gone. Researchers also began investigating what happened to Cleopatra's children. History records that 3 of them were captured by Octavian and taken to Rome. But one child, Caesarion, her son with Julius Caesar, supposedly died shortly after his mother. The circumstances were vague. No body was ever produced. Roman sources simply stated he was executed on Octavian's orders. Fifth Crow's letter mentioned children being prepared for a sea voyage, plural. If Cleopatra had successfully evacuated some or all of her children before the Romans closed in, that would explain why the historical record around them becomes so unclear. Octavian would have needed to claim they were captured or dead to prevent them from becoming rallying points for resistance. The investigation expanded to records from Arabian kingdoms and Indian trading posts that existed during the 1st century BC. Researchers found fragmentary references in Arabian chronicles to Egyptian refugees arriving by ship around the year 30 BC. One text mentioned a wealthy woman of high status who established a household in a coastal city and lived there for several years. The description was frustratingly vague, but the timing matched. Indian port records from the same period showed Egyptian vessels arriving with unusual cargo manifests, the kinds of supplies someone would need to establish a new life far from home. These documents had been available to historians for decades, but nobody had connected them to Cleopatra because everyone assumed she died in Alexandria. The strongest evidence came from genetic analysis. In 2023, researchers tested DNA samples from ancient remains found in an Arabian burial site that dated to approximately 25 BC, 5 years after Cleopatra's supposed death. The remains showed genetic markers consistent with Egyptian royal lineage and Greek ancestry, exactly what you would expect from Cleopatra's family. The scientific community remains divided. Some historians insist the evidence is circumstantial, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. Others argue that Fifth Crow's letter, combined with archaeological findings, creates a compelling case that Cleopatra's death was the greatest deception of the ancient world. What nobody disputes anymore is that the traditional story, the asp, the mausoleum, the tragic self-death, came from sources with obvious motivations to lie. Octavian built an empire on the claim that he had defeated Rome's enemies and brought peace to the Mediterranean. The truth about Cleopatra would have undermined everything, so he created a legend instead, and that legend became history, until a Roman spy, knowing he was about to die, took the time to write down what he actually saw and hide it where only chance could bring it back to light 2,000 years later. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.